In Latin America today, the showdown over Venezuela is no longer a quiet diplomatic dispute on the margins of world politics. It has become a test of will between three powerful leaders: US President Donald Trump, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and Russian President Vladimir Putin, as US warships close in on the Caribbean and Russian missiles reportedly arrive on Venezuelan soil. A trusted Trump ally has been dispatched to cool tempers in Caracas, even as Moscow signals that it is ready to stand by Maduro if Washington goes too far. This is the tense backdrop to a flurry of quiet, high-stakes contacts between Trump's inner circle and Maduro's government. Early in his new term, Trump authorized a close political ally and special envoy to open channels with Caracas, looking for a way to manage a crisis that is part migration emergency, part drug war, and part great power confrontation. In those first meetings, the envoy made clear that Washington was prepared to talk, but not to simply back away. He explained to confidants that, in his words, the dialogue is a tactic, a way to lower the temperature without abandoning pressure. At the center of this confrontation is Nicolas Maduro, who has just been sworn in for a third six-year term after a fiercely disputed election. Opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez claims he actually won the vote. The United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom have all rejected the result and slapped new sanctions on top Venezuelan officials. Maduro, however, insists he is the legitimate president and vows never to betray what he calls the Bolivarian revolution. For Trump, Venezuela has become both a national security issue and a political symbol. His administration has branded Maduro a narco-terrorist, accused him of running the so-called Cartel de los Soles, and placed a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head. At sea, the US military has shifted from traditional Coast Guard interdictions to lethal naval strikes on boats it says are carrying drugs toward the United States, killing dozens of people in recent months. Officials argue that only overwhelming force can deter the cartels and the Venezuelan networks that allegedly protect them. Yet even as the Pentagon deploys thousands of troops, fighter jets and the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group close to Venezuela's shores, Trump himself has tried to keep the world guessing about how far he is willing to go. In a recent interview, when asked whether the United States was heading toward war with Venezuela, he said, "I doubt it, I don't think so, but they've been treating us very badly." That ambiguity is deliberate. Trump wants Maduro and the world to believe that military options are on the table without locking himself into a full-scale conflict that could spiral out of control. Behind the scenes, aides and allies emphasize that the White House prefers a mix of sanctions, legal pressure, and limited strikes on alleged drug trafficking targets while using diplomacy to manage escalation. But the size of the US naval buildup tells another story. This is a pressure campaign backed by real firepower. On the Venezuelan side, Maduro has responded with a blend of defiance and outreach. In televised ceremonies in Caracas, he appears in camouflage uniform, flanked by generals and civilian militia leaders, promising to defend the country's sovereignty at any cost. After a US strike on a boat in the Caribbean killed 11 people, Maduro accused Washington of using the war on drugs as a pretext for regime change and warned that any attack on Venezuelan soil would be met with resistance. He mobilized civilian militias that he says number in the millions, though independent estimates suggest far fewer, and framed the moment as a historic test of national dignity. Maduro's rhetoric is not new. For years, he has cast foreign aid and international criticism as cover for attempts to topple his government. In one earlier confrontation, he said Venezuela won't allow the spectacle of fake humanitarian aid because we're no one's beggars. That line captured how he wants Venezuelans to see this crisis not as a dispute over democracy or drugs, but as a struggle against imperial humiliation. Now, Russia has stepped onto the stage with a louder voice and a more visible military footprint. In recent months, Russian warships from the Northern Fleet, including The advanced frigate Admiral Gorshkov have sailed close to the US coastline before docking in Cuba and then Venezuela, the first such deployment near American shores in years. Russian officials described these missions as routine exercises to show the flag, but the timing is unmistakable. Moscow is reminding Washington that it can operate in the US backyard, just as the United States has long operated in Russia's. Military cooperation is deepening on land as well. A senior Russian lawmaker recently confirmed that Moscow has delivered new Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E air defense systems to Venezuela, flown in by heavy transport aircraft. Those systems add to existing Russian-supplied S-300 VMs and earlier Buk batteries, giving Caracas a stronger shield against airstrikes than many analysts expected, even as Russia itself is straining to replace equipment lost in Ukraine. Diplomatically, Russia has also sharpened its language at the start of November as reports of US strikes and deployments mounted. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova denounced what she called Washington's use of overwhelming force in the Caribbean. She said, "We resolutely condemn the use of excessive military force and stress Moscow's full support for Venezuela's efforts to safeguard its sovereignty and keep Latin America a zone of peace." It is these statements that form the backdrop to sensational headlines suggesting that Putin has joined the fight over Venezuela and won't allow an attack on Maduro's government. In reality, the picture is more complicated. Russia has signed a strategic partnership agreement with Venezuela, sent naval vessels to the region and delivered new air defense systems. But analysts point out that Russia is deeply bogged down in its war against Ukraine and may be reluctant to commit large numbers of troops or offensive missiles to a potential showdown with the United States in the Western Hemisphere. One defense expert bluntly observed that given Moscow's manpower and logistical constraints, he does not see Putin sending troops to bail Maduro out. Still, symbolism matters. For Maduro, photos of Russian frigates in Venezuelan ports and footage of Russian anti-aircraft systems arriving at air bases send a powerful message to both supporters and opponents. He is not isolated, and powerful friends are willing to stand beside him. For Trump, those same images are ammunition in the domestic debate, reinforcing his argument that the United States must act forcefully or risk ceding influence in its own region to rival powers like Russia and China. This is where Trump's ally-turned-envoy comes in. After his initial contacts with Venezuelan officials, he returned to Washington, arguing that there was still space to de-escalate if each side could climb down without losing face. He pressed the Maduro camp to consider limited, verifiable concessions, allowing more humanitarian access, accepting some electoral monitoring, and quietly curbing the activities of certain military units suspected of involvement in drug trafficking. In return, he suggested that Washington might slow the pace of new sanctions, adjust some criminal indictments, and publicly acknowledge any small steps Caracas took. But these diplomatic efforts are unfolding against a harsher reality on the ground. Inside Venezuela, years of economic collapse, sanctions and political repression have left millions in poverty or exile. In some neighborhoods, ordinary citizens are being trained for what the government describes as popular resistance in case of foreign attack. One woman, a seamstress who joined a Bolivarian militia, described her mindset in stark terms. She said, "We don't want anyone coming along and interfering here. We won't allow it." Her words capture the mix of fear, pride, and propaganda that the Maduro government relies on as it prepares the population for a prolonged standoff. From Washington's perspective, however, the crisis is as much about drugs and migration as it is about ideology. The Trump administration has tied its strikes on Venezuelan-linked boats to a broader war on cartels, arguing that groups like the Tren de Aragua pose a direct threat to American cities. At the same time, Trump has ended key protections for Venezuelan migrants in the United States, insisting that allowing hundreds of thousands to stay temporarily would undermine his efforts to control the southern border. In public, Trump blends that security narrative with a broader condemnation of the Maduro regime. He portrays Venezuela as a once rich country ruined by socialism, corruption and criminal networks. And he suggests that bringing pressure to bear on Caracas is part of a larger effort to secure democracy and stability in the hemisphere. In private, aides admit that domestic politics also plays a role. Taking a tough line on Maduro is popular with some Latin American diaspora communities and with voters who associate Venezuela with the dangers of left-wing authoritarianism. For Russia, the calculus is different. Supporting Maduro offers leverage in Washington's backyard at relatively low cost. Naval deployments, missile deliveries and diplomatic statements allow the Kremlin to signal that any US intervention in Venezuela could come with a price, not necessarily a direct clash with Russian troops, but perhaps a widening of tensions in other theatres, including Ukraine or the Middle East. Russian officials have hinted that they view Venezuela as part of a broader struggle against what they call US unilateralism and illegal sanctions. Yet there are limits. Analysts note that Russia's own armed forces are stretched thin and its economy is under heavy Western sanctions. Long-term, high-intensity deployments to Latin America would be costly and risky. In one recent assessment, a European security expert described Russia's strategic partnership with Venezuela as just a piece of paper when measured against the realities of distance, logistics and ongoing war. The most likely Russian response to a major US strike, they argue, would be to step up weapons deliveries and diplomatic retaliation rather than to fight American forces head-on. That tension between symbolism and substance also shapes the role of Trump's envoy. His mission is not to make peace between Washington and Caracas in any grand sense. It is to keep open a narrow corridor of communication so that miscalculations do not trigger a conflict neither side genuinely wants. In private meetings, he has tried to reassure Venezuelan officials that the presence of US warships does not automatically mean an invasion is imminent, while also pressing them to avoid provocations, such as buzzing US ships with fighter jets that could force Trump to respond militarily. Looking ahead, several scenarios are possible. The crisis could settle into a tense stalemate, with US forces patrolling the Caribbean, Venezuelan militias drilling for war, and Russian ships making periodic visits to showcase Moscow's reach. In that scenario, quiet talks might produce limited agreements on humanitarian access, prisoner releases or election observers without fundamentally changing the power balance in Caracas. A second, more dangerous path would involve a sudden incident, a misidentified aircraft, a clash at sea or a deadly skirmish between US forces and Venezuelan units that spirals into retaliatory strikes. In such a crisis, Russian advisors and air defense systems would be on the front line, and global markets would react sharply to the risk of open war in an oil-producing country supported by one of the world's main nuclear powers. And there is a third, more hopeful possibility. Under enough pressure at home and abroad, Maduro could quietly accept a negotiated transition that preserves his personal safety while opening space for a more competitive political system. In that scenario, Trump could claim victory without a war, Russia could present itself as a responsible mediator rather than a spoiler, and Venezuela could begin the long path out of economic collapse. For now, though, there is little concrete sign that any of the key players are ready to make concessions on that scale. What is clear is that the Venezuela crisis has become a vivid example of how local conflicts can entangle global powers in 2025. A regional clash over narcotics, migration and authoritarian rule has drawn in the US. Navy, Russian warships, missile systems and strategic doctrines shaped distant battlefields. Between those hard edges of power, a single envoy, a trusted ally of Trump, is trying to keep conversation alive, betting that the dialogue is a tactic that can still pull Washington and Caracas back from the brink. Whether that tactic is enough in an age of geopolitical rivalry and domestic political pressure remains an open question.